Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a Lab 2 video for DHCP in Server 2003. In this video, we're going to take a close look at several different concepts, but mostly relating to fault tolerance in DHCP. Now, we're going to do this first by adding an additional server to our network. We're going to add a server 3 here, as you see in a second. So we're going to go through the installation of DHCP on this server, and then we're going to focus on planning our scopes. Okay, now there's going to be two different scopes on server 2 and server 3, and both of these scopes will service our one current network that we have running on the 192.168.1.0 network ID. And when we finish up, of course, we're going to do some client testing to give you a feel for how this fault-tolerant DHCP scope actually works. Let's take a look at our network diagram that we're dealing with here. Now, this network's exactly the same as we were dealing with in the previous lab, except for now we've added server 3 that you see up here. Okay, and if you look, server 3 is added onto the same network ID, 192.168.1.230, and it has the default gateway and everything else. It's similar to the other networks as well. Okay, so server 2 will be running DHCP, and then server 3 is going to be running DHCP as well. Server 1 will be acting as its same role that it did in the previous lab as our domain controller and as a DNS server. Okay, so it really is not going to be involved in this lab except for sitting in the background helping out. Now, one thing I want to point out to you. A lot of people get confused here when we start talking about this fault tolerance, and they think that maybe these scopes, okay, the scopes that we're going to create on server 2 and then server 3, maybe these scopes should actually consist of IP addresses from two different network IDs. Okay, so for example, in Lab 1, we set up a scope that encompassed 192.168.1.1 all the way through .254. So then maybe on server 3, what we might do is set up a second scope that's 192.168, let's say .2.1, all the way through .254. Okay, well, what's going to happen here is it's not going to work how we want it to. Okay, if you set up a scope on this machine for a different network ID, this is not going to service our DHCP clients that we see over here. All right, so we have one XP machine here, but keep in mind this is just representative of the 100 or 200 different machines that we have currently on our network. Let's assume, by the way, that we do have around 200 machines that we want to service on this network. Okay, and to make it even easier, let's just say 150, so we're not pushing the number. So we've got about 150 computers is what our goal is as far as IP addresses that are going to be leased out. Okay, 150. Now, first thing we're going to do is just go over to server 3 and we'll do a quick installation of DHCP on server 3 because we're going to have that there, and will give us a chance to quickly review how we're going to set up this server as well. Okay, so we're going to do a remote desktop connection over to server 3. And server 3 has been set up almost identically as server 2 was. Okay, so we'll log on here. Okay, so server 3, we see that it's named server 3. My computer has been just renamed to server 3. We have a green desktop background to help identify this as server 3 as well. And this is just going to be our second DHCP server. Okay, so what we're going to need to do is go to Start, Control Panel, Add or Remove Programs, and then add DHCP onto this computer. Okay, and to do that, it's just like we did in server 2. You're clicking Add Remove Windows Components, and you're going to install this DHCP service, which is not installed by default when you install Windows Server 2003. After this is installed, after we get DHCP installed, then we'll start going through and worrying about configuring the scope and any other options that we may choose to configure now as well. Okay, so it should pop up any second now here, and we'll continue on. And DHCP, if I remember correctly, is installed on this machine already. So we're just going to take a quick peek at this just to make sure that you're comfortable with what you see before we continue on from there. All right, here it comes. This machine, by the way, we're running a pretty slow machine. This is a Pentium 2 400 megahertz machine, which may account for some of the reason why this is so slow, and it's probably got minimal amount of RAM as well. So if we go down here to Networking Services, click here, we do see that DHCP is already installed. Okay, and that's just because we're doing some testing on this machine ahead of time. You will need to check this, click OK, and then finish out the wizard however it is necessary. And you're probably going to be prompted for a CD as well. Now the next thing you want to make sure that you do, and I don't think this is done currently, so if you right click my computer, go up here to properties, I'm going to join this computer actually to the domain. Right now it's just a member of a work group, so we're going to change this, join this computer to the domain, wbc.local, click OK here, okay, and we can't contact this domain controller. So by the way, take a look at this message. Domain controller for the domain wbc.local could not be contacted. Ensure the domain name is typed correctly. Pretty sure the domain name is correct, but if we go down here and reference our DNS information, okay, on our TCP/IP settings, most likely this is not pointing out to server 1 who's acting as our DNS server. Okay, you can see here it's pointing to itself for any DNS name resolutions, and since DNS is not configured on this computer, that's going to get us nowhere. Okay, so I type in 100, click OK here, and we're going to go right back in here again. Let's see if we can't find WBC local now. Okay, this time no problem, and it asks us for authentication this time, which we can provide. Okay, and this is just going to join us to the domain, assuming we got our credentials typed in there correctly. And then after that happens, we will have to reboot this machine. So what I'm going to do right now, as soon as this joins the domain, we will stop this video momentarily and then start right back up again after this machine has rebooted. Okay, and to summarize, just so we have all this together, we've got a Server 2003 machine. IP address settings are going to match exactly to what Server 2 has, except the host, the actual host portion of the IP address will be different, of course. It has to be on a TCP/IP network. We're going to join it to the domain, wbc.local in this case, okay, and install DHCP, and that's really all that has to happen on this machine. So I'm going to click OK here and indicate that we want to restart this system. Okay, so that ends our connection here. I'm going to stop the video, and we'll pick right back up again as soon as it restarts. Okay, Server 3 has rebooted, so our housework is completed over there. Before we connect back over to Server 3, though, I want to take a look at this diagram here once again and talk about what we're going to do when we actually set up this scope here that we're going to configure on Server 3. Now, we already spoke of a little bit that we have 150 DHCP clients, okay, this number here. And the network that we're working with, this segment right here, this is the 192.168.1 network. Okay, and you can see that if you look at the network ID here, all of the first 3 octets in any of these IP addresses for the server shown and the client shown is 192.168.1. So we want these 2 servers to service this segment. How are we going to set this up so Server 2 has a certain number of IP addresses and Server 3 has a certain number of IP addresses that it's giving out? Okay, and let me reiterate what I mean by that. If you recall from the first lab, we set it up so Server 2 actually gave out all the IP addresses. Okay, so it was set up with a scope of 192.168.1 through 254. Okay, 1 through 254. And then we had exclusions set up so it didn't give out IP addresses 200, or no, we did it individually for 100, 200, and 230. Okay, and the rest of the IP addresses it was free to give out. Okay, well, if we do that exact same configuration here for Server 3, what's going to happen is Server 3 will give out IP addresses, the exact same ones that Server 2 gave out. Okay, think about that. If we put up here a scope that gives out 1 through 254, just write this out here poorly. Okay, and then we do the exact same exclusions for 100, Server 1, 200, Server 2, and then 230, Server 3. That's great, but what happens when one of these clients broadcasts out? They're going to ask for an IP address, and if they speak with Server 2, well, Server 2 is going to give them an IP address, first one available, probably 1. And Server 3 is going to do the same thing. It's going to give an IP address of 192.168.1.1 out to the next client that comes in. And what do we know about IP addresses? We can't use the exact same IP address on 2 hosts within the same network. That's just not going to work. Now, the next thing people ask me, well, don't these databases work together? Can't Server 2 and Server 3 kind of talk to each other and have a consolidated database? And hey, that makes a lot of sense, but that's not the way it works. Okay, you would think that maybe they would share a DHCP database. What we have to do instead, change these scopes around. Okay, and we can do this any way we want, but the best way is to take your scope and really just kind of divide it into two parts. Okay, so for this one here, for example, since we have 1 through 254, an even number somewhere in between is about 127. So if we want to do it that way, what we can do is just take our eraser out here, and we're going to change this scope up, okay, to 1 through 127. Okay, so what that means then is server 2, the DHCP server here, will be giving out IP addresses between 1 and 127. So a client broadcasts out, talks to server 2, and this particular IP address they'll give out will be 192.168.1.1 initially. And this will continue to happen, so it'll give out IP addresses between 1 and 127. Now, over here, we're going to have to change this scope as well. If we left this how we have it written out, this is still going to have, our server 3 will still give out IP addresses starting with 1 up through 254. Okay, so now instead of it being 1 through 254, let's erase this 1 here, and we'll make it from 128. Sorry about the writing there. Okay, 128 through 254. Okay, so we basically taken the available IP addresses and then split them up in half. And notice what we're going to have to do with our exclusions now. Well, we have those 3 numbers that we still want to make sure that no IP addresses are given out on. Actually, there's 4 numbers if you count this one too. So what we'll have to do is come over here to scope 1. And on this first scope, what we're going to do is set this up so this server has 100 excluded. That's going to be the only exclusion over here, just 192.168.1.100. And then over here on server 3, we're going to have to exclude 200, 230, and 254. All 3 of these IP addresses will be excluded. Okay, so that's basically what we're going to do initially. Let's set our scopes up in this fashion. Now start to make sure that you understand too exactly what's going to happen here. You may be wondering where the fault tolerance is or how we actually set this up so our 150 client machines are going to be able to get their IP addresses. Well, in both of these scopes, we've got 1 through 127 and 128 through 254. We really don't care whether our client draws from the scope on server 2 or from the scope on server 3. Okay, keep that in mind. XP1 over here doesn't really matter if it ends up with an IP address of 192.168.1.10 or 192.168.1.200 from this scope. Because ever IP address it gets, it's still going to be able to communicate with the servers on the network. It's going to have the same DNS information pointing to server 1, the same default gateway information pointing outbound to the internet. So it doesn't really matter which IP address it gets. Now what will happen, since we have roughly 150 clients, let's just say that 75 of them end up with server 2 and 75 end up speaking with server 3. In a case like that, well, you can see that we're well within the number of IP addresses that we have, 1 through 127. 75 still leaves us with roughly 50 IP addresses left over. And the same thing up here with 128 through 254. So what this allows us to do, if one of these servers were to actually fail one day, let's say server 3 goes down, all the IP addresses that the 75 clients over here, all the IP addresses that they picked up, these aren't just going to go away instantly. For example, remember when you get an IP address, you're assigned a lease period. So if your lease is that default period of 8 days, you have that length of time, however much is left over of your lease, before you have to give up that IP address. Okay, so basically, if server 3 were to fail, we have 127 IP addresses over here to work with, plus we have these, roughly 127 IP addresses to work with here. They're going to start slowly fading out. After 8 days, they'll be completely eliminated because the leases will expire. But if you do, some math here and you divide 127 by the 8 days, we're talking roughly, let's just say 15 IP addresses will be expended daily. Okay, if just assuming that the leases are spread out equally. So in a case like that, then, you really have 3 or 4 days to get this DHCP server back online, or some other method. We could maybe set up a super scope over here or something. We'll talk about that in the next lab. Okay, so let's keep it basic right now, though. 2 scopes, Doesn't matter which IP address that the client draws from, either one is going to be okay. If one of these servers were to fail, it's going to be okay for, good 2, 3, 4 days before we have to start worrying about us running out of IP addresses. If server 3 fails, our clients can pull from these IP addresses over here, and it's still going to be able to connect to the network. Okay, let's go over to server 3 then. Let's actually configure this. We're going to set it up so we're configuring it with 128.254 as the scope. So we'll form a remote desktop connection over to server 3. Okay, and we're back in that same machine, server 3 here. And we're going to open up DHCP. Okay, and before we do anything, what we need to do, let's connect to it, make sure everything's okay. We see that DHCP is not even authorized yet. We have this red down arrow here, which is indicating to us that either the service is stopped or it's just not authorized. So if I right-click here, go down to All Tasks, I see that I have Stop here, which means that it's currently started. See, starts grayed out. Okay, so that's not the problem. So what we really need to do is authorize this server. Keep in mind that DHCP was installed previously, but this machine has not been approved as a DHCP server in our lab. Okay, and right now what's going on, this service is actually downed by the domain controller. Let's watch what happens here. If I go to All Tasks and then restart this machine, what we may see here momentarily is this machine will start up. Okay, and then once it starts up, it'll remain that way for a little bit. Okay, it's not doing it for us. But what'll happen, okay, this is the whole deal with authorization. If we were to set up a scope, activate that scope, enable it, that DHCP server is going to act as if it's up and running. Okay, and the Active Directory, the domain controller, will actually cause this server to stop. Okay, it'll make the red down arrow show up here again because this server has not yet been authorized. Okay, that's what'll happen in a production environment if you were to try this out. So let's go ahead and authorize it. We'll click Authorize, and this is exactly what we did in the first lab. Let's try that again. Okay, well that's pretty simple. We didn't have to do much. We didn't have to enter anything in at all. This server's been up long enough where it didn't even ask us to specify the IP address. So it has been authorized, it looks like. What we're going to do here right now is go ahead and create the scope. And we'll see what happens after we create the scope. So we need to right-click on the server, then go down to New Scope, and this will take us through our little wizard here. Okay, you can get this as descriptive as you want here. Name description, description's optional. Okay, this is very important, and we're going to do this based on the settings that we were talking about before. And this is what, 128 through 254. Okay, the subnet mask must be 255.255.255.0 in our case. That's how we have our network set up. Exclusions. Remember, if we come back here real quick, this is going to be any machine that has a static IP address, okay, and falls within this range. So for us, that's server 3, that's server 2, and that's our default gateway, our ISIS server. Okay, so it's 200, 230, and 254. 100 does not fall within this range because that's up here on scope 2. We'll take care of that in a second. Okay, so to take care of these, okay, there's 200. Add that one in. Now we're going to do 230. And then lastly, we're going to do 254, our default gateway. Okay, so there are 3 exclusions. Addresses excluded within the actual range of IP addresses. Okay, so I'll click Next. And by the way, let's see what does happen if I type in 100. Okay, and click Add. Notice that it tells us the IP address range is not a subset of the overall range. Okay, maybe a little bit more complex message than is necessary here. But remember, we're trying to exclude an IP address here that's actually not even part of the scope. we said 128 through 254, those would be the IP addresses that we give out. This IP address here is not even part of that scope, so that's why it ends up giving us that error message. So we'll click Next. The lease time we're going to leave here is 8 days, and we may even want to stretch this up. Remember, in our case here, if the leases expire too quickly and one of our DHCP servers goes down, well, in that case, we may run out of time. Maybe it's going to take us 7 days to get our server back up and running. We have to order a new server and do all this other stuff. Well, in that case, you may want to set your lease time a little bit higher. Okay, it's not really a big deal though. We can always make modifications after the fact. We can easily change our scope on a DHCP server while the one was down, so it's not too critical. Okay, and I would recommend, for opposite reasons, that you don't up this too much. Remember, we're dealing with wireless clients, laptop computers that travel and take IP addresses with them. If you set your lease time really high, let's say we double it to 16 days, well, that laptop user is going to leave the network and actually hold on to that IP address. They may be gone for a month before they're back in the office again. So if anything, you're probably better off with shorter lease times. But in our case, for our environment, the default of 8 days is okay. For your environment, I recommend that you leave it alone, see what happens, okay, see if this actually becomes a problem. If it does, adjust it after the fact. There's no reason that you really need to stress about this setting, at least initially. So we'll select 8 days, the default, click Next. Okay, and then we have to decide whether or not we want to configure these scope options. Now, we're going to go ahead and say no, we'll configure these later, just so we can get some more experience with a manual configuration of these. We'll click Next, Finish. Okay, and now we see that we have the server here is authorized, but the scope is still showing as inactive. Okay, so I'm going to right-click this scope and then click Activate here. Okay, so nothing shows up negatively here, so it looks like our scope should be okay. And if we want to test this out, what can we do? Well, we'll go back over to the client machine, and we can test the scope right from here. We can see if it's actually live. The problem we're going to run into right now, though, when we try to test this, oops, I want to look at this picture. Well, if we run ipconfig, release, and then renew on XP1, it's going to broadcast out for an IP address, but we have no control over whether server 2 or server 3 is going to service us. Remember, it's first come, first serve, so whoever gets back to us is going to be the DHCP server that we go with. So, what we really need to do if we want to test and see if the scope is working correctly, we'd have to disable server 2 or disable DHCP at least temporarily. Okay, so if we want to do that, let's go ahead and do that. We'll connect over to server 2, open up DHCP, okay, and then you have several options when you get in there. You could deactivate the scope if you chose to. You could just stop the service here on server 2. Okay, I'm going to come down here, and we'll just go to all tasks and then pause. Okay, just momentarily have this machine pause here. So what's going to happen when you pause it? It's not going to accept any new registrations. Okay, so if somebody were to broadcast out right now, it wouldn't service that. So from here, we're going to go ahead and release this IP address. By the way, let's make sure you know what we have currently. Okay, right now we have 192.168.1.25. Okay, and you can see that we picked this IP address up from .200, which is server 2. Okay, so we're going to come down, we're going to run ipconfig release. Okay, this is releasing our IP address. And now we're going to run ipconfig renew. Now we're broadcasting back out there on the network looking for a DHCP server. Okay, so this machine's looking, hoping to find some server out there to give it an IP address. Okay, and eventually you see that we do get an IP address back here, 192.168.1.128. So you can see that that falls within our scope of 128 through 254 that we just set up on server 3. We did get a subnet mask, but notice there's no default gateway because we didn't configure that option. And if we were to do the more revealing ipconfig /all, we would also see that we have no DNS server enabled, no Win server. Those options don't even show up here. Okay, so that's something that we probably want to take a look at. Okay, let's go ahead and connect back over then to server 2. Okay, and sitting here on server 2, what we're going to do now, we're going to have to change this scope up. Okay, because if we look at the scope, remember the scope that we set up initially is going to cross over into what we had before. If you look, it's 1 through 254, and now we're going to change this so it only goes through 127. Okay, we're going to leave the duration at 8 days, and we'll click OK here. All that information looks good. Okay, another thing we want to take a look at, address pool. You see that we still have these exclusions here. We're going to get rid of these exclusions. They don't mean anything at this point because those IP addresses are not even included within the range. And we also have a reservation set up. We did this in lab 1 as well. Okay, and we got a reservation set up for XP1 here. We're going to get rid of this reservation. Okay, we don't want this reservation here because this is going to make sure that XP1 gets .25 every single time. So we'll delete this, click yes. Okay, and now we're back to basically a pristine DHCP installation. What's happened here, just to give you a feel since we didn't go through the wizard, we have a range 1 through 127. We have an exclusion, IP address 100, which is server 1's IP address. Currently, there is one lease out there right now, okay, and this is just some machine that was out there on the network. Okay, it's not even valid on this network anymore, so we're going to get rid of it. Reservations, none. Scope options, okay, you can see right here that we do have scope options configured. This is something that has not been done on server 3 at this time. Okay, and most likely these scope options are going to match up, if not identically, pretty closely to what we see here. We're going to go take care of these now over on server 3, and then we're going to start worrying about testing, taking a look at how this works from the client's perspective. Okay, so we're connecting back over to server 3, and what we'll do now is configure our scope options manually. So here, when we open up scope options, there's nothing here. We can right-click, go to configure options, and now we can start setting these options. Okay, and option 003 is one option that we're definitely going to want to set. This is the default gateway. Yes, it says router, but this is just the traditional boot P mentioning of this particular option. Okay, it means default gateway, and that's what we're going to enter in here as our default gateway. Okay, and by the way, there's a ton of options in here. Okay, if we go through there and start cycling through, we see all sorts of different ones. There are very few options that we really want to set. There's 5, 6 different options, and the rest of them you should really leave alone. Okay, these are options that are there for backwards compatibility with the Bootstrap protocol, Boot P. We talked about that in the concepts video, but you know, there's nothing that's going to benefit you by setting these. They don't work within 2000 or 2003. Okay, we will set our DNS servers option here. Okay, and this is just going to specify the IP address of the DNS server or servers on the network, because we can add multiple DNS servers down below. Okay, we'll set the DNS domain name. This is just going to be the DNS suffix, wbc.local. And a couple more things we'll set. Option 044, this is for a Win server. Okay, and our Win server, Wins happens to be running on 192.168.1.100, server 1. And we also have another option called Wins NetBIOS node type. Okay, and we'll save this entry really for, or talking about this for our Wins Lab 6. We won't talk much about that in this particular video. But when you look here, you see the different broadcast nodes, okay? And we have B node, P node, M node, and H node. H node is the most popular, and it's actually the default. If you just do this with the wizard, that's when we're going to be using here hybrid mode, which specifies that my Wins client will first talk to a Win server. If it doesn't find a Win server, then it will broadcast out looking for a NetBIOS name resolution. Okay, if that means nothing to you, don't worry about it. It's not something you need to worry about at this point right now. Okay, and that's really all we have to do for our scope options. Now when I click OK, you see that these options are all populated here. These can always be changed at a later time just by right-clicking, going to Properties, okay, and then specifying the option you want and just changing it to whatever you need to. Okay, so pretty simple as far as that is concerned. Okay, so now we have our scope really set up how we were looking for. So pretty straightforward. If we go back here to our diagram, we have two scopes. Server 2 is servicing 1 through 127. Server 3 is servicing 128 through 254. When XP1 broadcasts out right now, currently it has the IP address 128 from Server 3's scope. We're going to do a little bit of fault tolerance here, and we're going to see what happens when Server 3 actually is not available. Okay, and you can do this several ways. You can stop the service like I did before. You can even pull the cable on Server 3 if that's easier. It doesn't really matter. Now, what we'll take a look at, let's go ahead and go over to Server 3. And what we'll do here, so we're not really messing with the DHCP service at all. We're going to close this, and we're just going to pull the network cable. So I'm going to pull this cable here. So I'm going to pause this video while I do that. And then once I've pulled the cable, we will start this video right back up again, and we'll get a feel for how this works. Okay, I did pull the cable on Server 3. Now we still see the desktop here because this screen was already present, but when I try clicking around in here, here's the start button. I'm trying to actually open this up. It shows like it's connected here, but the reason is the network cable is not plugged in, so I can't see the current status. So everything I try here in Server 3 is not going to work. And in a second, I would guess that we'll see our disconnect notice telling us that we can't connect right now over to Server 3. Okay, as you can see here too, here's the disconnect attempt. It's trying to reconnect. Well, this just isn't happening because the network cable is not plugged in, as we mentioned. So we're going to cancel, close this out here while we talk about what's going on. Okay, so what we'll do from the client machine, first things first, let's go ahead and run ipconfig. Okay, and when I run ipconfig, let's take a look at what we see here. Now, may confuse you for a couple different reasons. Number one, we are pulling the IP address still from Server 3, 192.168.1.128. So in other words, this machine's broadcasting out, or did broadcast out, picked up this IP address, and now we pulled the plug on Server 3, so Server 3 is offline. Okay? Yet we still have this IP address from Server 3. Okay, and we talked about this before. The reason this is because we've got this lease. We own this IP address for a specified amount of time. If we go over here and look, lease obtained, okay, here, Monday, November 8th, and it's good until Tuesday, November 16th. Okay, so we own this lease until that time. This computer can actually use this IP address even if Server 3 is down for all that time until next Tuesday at 6:18 p.m. Okay, so there's nothing stopping it. Okay, next thing you may have a question on, I guess I shouldn't have closed that window. Okay, is why don't we have that default gateway information, DNS information, WINS information? Well, we just changed that scope once again before we obtain this lease. If we were to refresh and renew right now, and Server 3 was back online, you'd see that we would pick up that information, but we just hadn't renewed our lease when there were scope options present. Well, let's go ahead and try this. What does happen? Let's go ahead and cancel out our lease. Okay, and now we're going to renew it. So I run ipconfig/renew, and we'll give this a second here. We're going to wait and see whether Server 2, Server 3, or anybody responds to us. Okay, because Server 3, the network cable is disconnected. And on Server 2, I'm not so sure we didn't restart that service. So, which is okay, because if Server 2 is not available, we'll get a third option, which is something that we need to talk about anyway. And you've probably come across this several times on a home network, at a work network, and that is the automatic private IP addressing 169.254 network ID that you sometimes get. Okay, and this is a new feature they put into Windows 2000 and Server 2003. It's also present in Windows 98. What it's designed to do is give you an IP address and some basic TCP/IP information when there is no DHCP server present. Okay, and you'll see here in a second it's going to time out. It's just taking a long time because there's no DHCP server available. Okay, and it tells us right here An error occurred while renewing interface local area connection, unable to contact your DHCP server. If I type in ipconfig, notice the IP address that I get, 169.254, and then the last two octets, 195 and 35. These are random numbers. Okay, now, basically what they're trying to do is set you up with some sort of get me by. Okay, if other computers in the network also are not able to contact a DHCP server, they're going to get the same network ID, 169.254. The problem is there's no default gateway information, okay, and servers, coming back here, remember servers are typically statically configured with IP addresses. So you've got this XP machine that can't contact a DHCP server, gets an IP address of 169.254.195.35. It's not going to be able to talk to anybody, not server 2, server 3, server 1, or the default gateway. So basically no internet, no email, no server contact, but you will be able to contact, other XP machines because they're going to be in the same situation you're in. And that's basically, they got that 169.254 IP address. Doesn't do you much good, okay? So this IP address and this, what they call a feature, is not really of much help in a small network. Okay, so what I'm going to do here, just get rid of this, and what we need to do is first let's exit out of here and connect over to server 2. So we're going to have to re-enable server 2 to finish out our testing. Okay, server 2 can't be contacted. Let's try it by IP address. Okay. Oh, not very smart here. What we've done, we just ran that ipconfig command. Okay, and we have a different IP address. So of course remote desktop's not going to work now because our IP address is 169.254. So when we try to contact server 2, we can't do it. Ouch. That hurts. So what we're going to do if I wanted to get out of this problem is just basically to statically configure an IP address, and just to work through this problem, show you how you do it, we'll go ahead and do that. So kind of a pain, but we're going to have to go through and do a little bit longer route. So I'll configure a static IP address here on the XP machine. And this is just temporary, and I can use anything that fits on this subnet. Okay, and we won't even bother with this other information right now because we're just going to be holding on to this long enough to form our remote desktop connection. I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so I've configured this IP address. It's going to accept it here any second. Thank you. Now we're forming that remote desktop connection back over to server 2. Now you can see we can connect over to it because we have statically configured an IP address. Now what we need to do is come back over here to server 2, right-click, all tasks, okay, and resume. We had paused it previously. We're going to resume the service now. So now this machine is capable of giving us an IP address. Close server 2 down. Now I'm back in the XP machine, and what I can do is configure this machine to obtain an IP address automatically and a DNS server address automatically. Now when I click OK, you'll see that it's dropped the 169.254 IP address. Okay, and now we've picked up 192.168.1.27. Okay, now keep in mind that we had statically configured this before, and for some reason, after you statically configure an IP address, the DHCP server likes to give you that same IP address out of its lease, out of the range, pardon me. Okay, so the range on server 2 is 192.168.1.1 through 127. It just gave me 27. For further proof, take a look here. We see that DHCP is enabled. We did get our default gateway setting. We got our DNS server setting, primary WIN server setting, and the lease was just set up Monday, November 8th at 6:34. Compare that down here with our time, and you can see that we just picked up this information. Okay, now let's go ahead and release this information again. And just for demonstration purposes, let's see what happens when we renew this lease here once again. Okay, you can see we pick up the same information. We just take back that, the reservation's actually no longer there. The lease is no longer there, but we still end up getting the same IP address. This is just kind of how DHCP works. It kind of caches that information, the fact that you had .27 before, and it doesn't randomly give you another IP address. Now, in the time where I had released that IP address, if after doing that another computer came along and just happened to get .27, when I renew, I'm not going to get .27. Okay, some other computer will take over that number and we'll get .27. And if you wanted to test it out, we could go back over there and exclude that IP address on server 2. Okay, just set up an exclusion for .27, and you'll see it'll pull just another IP address, most likely the beginning IP address out of the range 192.168.1.1. Okay, so if we connect back over to server 3, which I can't do here in front of you because we've disabled that network card, or we've unplugged it, I'm going to stop this video though for a second and plug it back in, and then we'll connect back over there. Okay, plug back in. So now I'm going to form that remote desktop connection back over to server 3. Okay, and what we can do now that we know that we can connect over here, we already have DHCP set up and ready to go. So we're just going to come back over here to our IP address situation here and run ipconfig release. Okay, now just to reiterate what's going on, both DHCP servers are currently available. So if we were to run this command right now, who do we talk to? Which DHCP server is actually going to give us our information? And it goes back to what we were talking about before. It's the first one that we contact is going to be the one to give us the information. And you can keep running this command over and over and over again for testing purposes. What I found when I do this is you tend to go back to the same DHCP server over and over and over again. So in this case here, we spoke with server 1 to get this IP, or I'm sorry, server 2 to get this IP address. If we run renew again here, most likely we're going to get that exact same IP address from server 2 again. Okay, and this tends to happen over and over and over again. Okay, you see we got it again. Okay, if you wanted to test, make sure server 3 is working. What I would recommend, just pull the plug, just like we did a second ago, on server 2. Okay, see what happens. And we'll do that here momentarily. I'll show you one last time just to give you a feel. So I'll pause it, pull the plug, and I'll start it right back up again. Okay, I pulled the plug on server 2. So now we're just going to run our ipconfig release command, release that IP address back, basically give it back so we no longer want this. And now we're going to run the renew command. And let's see what IP address we pick up now. Oh, I must have unplugged the wrong machine because obviously we shouldn't have been able to talk to that one. So let me try that again here. I'm going to stop the video and pull the right cable this time. Yeah, pull the right cable this time. Yeah, a second ago I pulled the cable on server 1. Now I've pulled the cable on server 2. So if we run this here again, we should see when we renew it that we're not picking up that IP address 27 up here. And that's because server 2 is not available. We can't pull an IP address from its scope. Okay. Any second now it should be pulling that IP address up. And this is going to be from server 3 once again, as we mentioned a second ago. Okay, and you can see 192.168.1.128. Now we are pulling the default gateway information. And if we want to look at all the information, we can get a better idea too. IP address 128, default gateway is correct, DHCP server. This is the IP address of server 3, okay, .230. So we are getting that information from server 3. Lease obtained November 8th, 6:40. Lease expires, okay, 8 days later, November 16th at 6:40. Okay, that wraps up Lab 2. We'll see you back here real soon in Lab 3 when we get more detailed about superscopes and then also some of the properties that you can configure on the DHCP server.